Welcome to the Diplowoman podcast, where we will be talking with and about incredible women mediators, facilitators, negotiators, ambassadors, peacemakers, peace builders, and more. I am Ekmekji, and I will be your host in this journey of mainstreaming the women, peace, and security agenda into our lifestyles. With a focus on the Arab region, the Diplowoman podcast comes to you in collaboration with the Issam Fars Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, and is made possible by the generous support of UN Women. The Arabic subtitled video edition is available on the Diplowoman podcast YouTube channel. We're thinking out loud with Aleksandra Dier Azadeh Moaveni in this new episode of the Diplowoman podcast. Aleksandra is the UN Women's Regional Advisor on the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in the Middle East and North Africa. Azadeh is the Director of the Gender and Conflict Project at the International Crisis Group. Aleksandra Azadeh, thank you for being with us today on the Diplowoman podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Karma.
Thank you, Karma and Alex.
Let me start by saying that UN Women, for the past decade and more, has been working on many issues, women-related, but one of the core work that you do is on women, peace, and security. And recently, you've published, in my view, an extremely important piece of literature that talks about women's participation in local mediation. And these lessons are learned from Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. We live in a region plagued with conflicts, plagued with uncertainty, volatility, war, and the role of women is becoming more and more not only important, but highlighted and underscored. And this paper does that in certain ways. So tell us, Aleksandra, what is this paper really about?
Yeah, thanks. So we are extremely proud that we've been able to publish this report just a few days ago. And I think it really sheds an important light on the contribution that women are making across the region to peace efforts at the local level. And why is this local level so important? It's important because we have a growing understanding that peace cannot just be made from the top down. I think we see this very clearly in all the conflicts in this region. You've mentioned Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen. In all of these cases, we're looking at protracted conflicts that we've been trying to solve through traditional, what we call track one level, formal peace processes. And we have to be honest that the successes have been extremely modest.
Something's not working.
Something is clearly not working. And one of the important things that is not working is this exclusive focus on that top level. And there is now an understanding that we need to be building peace from the ground up. And so this is where what happens at the community level is extremely important, and where women have a crucial role to play, and where we know they are actually playing a crucial role. So what we wanted to do in this publication is to look in more detail at that local level and really analyze how women are engaged, who these women are, what strategies they employ, what some of their successes have been, and what some of the challenges and obstacles that they encounter are, and how we can address those and overcome those.
And what have been some of those, the major findings of this paper?
So I think I think it's a really fascinating report that sheds light on a number of really important issues. But I would perhaps highlight three myths that are being debunked in this report. And I think that this is really important. Mm-hmm. So the first myth is that women don't take on roles as mediators. I think there is still very much a predominant perception when you think of a lead mediator in a conflict. You think about this sort of male figure of authority who takes on this very visible role of negotiating or facilitating the negotiations between the conflict parties. And what we show in this report is that women do actually play extremely important roles as mediators, but not necessarily in this visible lead mediator role. They very often portray the work that they do in ways that are a little bit more subtle. They kind of almost downplay their roles, you know? They don't necessarily say, well, we lead mediations, but they will say, well, we facilitate dialogue, or we engage in discussions at the community level.
Is this what you call in the report insider mediation then?
So yeah, so this is exactly, so many of the women who we interviewed as part of this report, they don't derive their status as mediators necessarily from a formal leadership role that they have, but from their proximity to the parties of the conflict and their intimate understanding of what the grievances and issues are. And this is this insider mediator role that they are able to play, and that they are able to play so effectively. And so we're documenting some of these examples and the very diverse profiles of these different women. So this is the one really key finding and sort of key myth that we are debunking. The other really important myth that we are debunking is that women only engage on a limited set of issues that are typically thought of as sort of more personal and family-related matters within the community, and that they don't engage in more political issues. And we show some really fascinating examples of women mediating local ceasefires, negotiating the release of political prisoners, negotiating cross-line humanitarian access, negotiating access to natural resources, water, and so forth. So really the full spectrum of issues that are so important at the community level, where so many tensions arise at the community level, and many of which are sort of very much at what we traditionally think of as sort of the hard end of the security and political spectrum. Right. So not just the soft issues. And so I think it's really important that this report is able to show that women do engage on all of these issues. And then the third issue that I think is really critical is around the issue of social norms and traditions. And I think what we are really able to again debunk here is this idea that it's somehow tradition that stands in the way of these women, and that it's because tradition somehow prevents women's political participation, or that if women participate politically and in peace efforts, they are somehow in violation of certain traditional social norms. And I think that the report shows in a really nuanced way how actually these arguments that are being presented around tradition, that's a particular interpretation of tradition that is very much being instrumentalized by those who hold power, predominantly men, of course, to actually marginalize these women and exclude these women so that they preserve their own superior status. And that if we look at the history of the region, there are actually many examples of women playing important roles within their communities, engaging to make peace, to be change agents, and so forth. And so it is not at all going against tradition, it is not at all going against religious norms or anything like that. And it is just so critically important to not just take these arguments at face value, but to really ask, okay, whose interpretation of tradition is being presented here? And is this really the truth? Or is there perhaps an alternative view that isn't being presented?
Fantastic. I mean, it's really a fascinating paper. I highly recommend that this is read by as many people as possible, because it helps us understand our communities, it helps us understand how peace is actually being made, as you said, locally. This paper is also available in Arabic, so I'm very happy about that because it comes from the region and we need to have it in Arabic as well. It will be available and we will be sharing with you the links of this paper. Traditionally, peacemaking, peace building or negotiations or conflict resolution was made by state actors. But as the nature of conflict evolved, the actors who make peace or who should be making peace should naturally evolve with the evolution of conflicts. And now we are faced with multi-layer diplomacy. You know, it's not only state actors who sit on the table or who should be sitting on the table, but many different stakeholders as well. Azadeh, you sit at a global think tank. You sit at the International Crisis Group, where you are doing more and more work on conflict resolution and more work on applying a gender lens to conflict resolution. Think tanks also have a big role to play, and clearly this role or this input is being carved day after day in the absence of others who are being able to achieve peace. Tell me a little bit about the work that you do. Tell us a little bit about, from where you're sitting, how do you see the conflicts in our region?
Thank you so much, Karma. And, you know, this is really an extraordinary paper and such an important discussion. So I'm really delighted to have the chance to share a little bit about where my work overlaps with the themes that you and Aleksandra have been talking about. You know, we are so many years in our region into women's roles being under-evaluated, unseen, really invisible. And it strikes me that we're now decades into this phenomenon. You know, throughout the middle of the 20th century, the early 20th century, all of the conflicts that we've had in our region, women have been at the forefront of trying to resolve, of trying to endure, of trying to minimize the impact on communities. So I think it's so critical to focus on documenting this, on bringing language that our young people and our communities can relate to and understand, to finally break out of this cycle of not seeing the contributions that women make. Because we have such a gap between what women do on the ground and in communities and in towns and in cities where conflict is rife, and women in formal politics. So women at the level of the city council, of parliament, of cabinets. And where is that gap? It partly comes from exactly what you and Aleksandra have been discussing, is that when women mediate, when women bring their influence into politics, it's often in different ways than men do. They're not status seeking. They're not trying to kind of deploy social reputation. And so often they're sort of then written out of what happens. So when the histories are written, or when we look back to our conflicts of 30 years past, 20 years past, women are not in the books, they're not in the record. And that perpetuates even this young generation who's so socially active, country to country, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, everywhere, socially active, activists at the forefront, but not as much represented in formal politics. So I think it's really critical to make the connections in our own consciousness about why we still have that gap. You asked though about Crisis Group and the work that we do as a think tank based in the fields, doing field research on conflicts, and then writing policy papers or writing reports, trying to map why those conflicts are happening and how they can be ended or the violence reduced. And we're trying increasingly to look at those actors and stakeholders and different sort of social forces who are part of the conflict and part of the solution to the conflict, but who are not seen at the high level tables. So for example, in Mali, in Iraq. I a couple of years ago, work on understanding the role, and the paper does an excellent job of highlighting this, the role of women in Iraq negotiating the return of families who had been accused of being collaborators or affiliated with ISIS in Iraq. The way that women were so crucial, because in a lot of these communities, men are still imprisoned and detained in Iraq. So it's actually women who are in the community who have to take back other women. And it's often sort of at the official level, mukhtars or tribal chiefs or different male authority figures who do the negotiation, but it's women who are in the position of being able to uphold it, to explain it to each other and accept it, to reject that outcome, or to agree amongst themselves, look, we need to put this conflict behind us, even though we're angry, our husbands were killed, we want revenge, we want compensation, we want some sort of accountability or justice, which are kind of often absent from the high level conversations. It's women who are in the rooms where the discussions that actually determine whether those agreements can hold, whether that community can reconcile or at least move on. So understanding and writing into our work all of that phenomenon. And sometimes that means widening the lens, persuading our fellow analysts that this is relevant, that transitional justice, that getting the community to accept the past and to feel like their pain and their loss is accepted, that's what transitional justice means in the end, that's not an add-on, that's not a soft issue, that's going to make or break your deal. So if women are pushing to have that as part of the agreements or as part of their role, you need that, because that's going to determine whether what the big men at the table agree can hold at the community level. So we're trying to essentially take all of that nuance and all of that kind of back room, living room, sitting in the tent, deciding, all of the work that women do, and bring it into the papers, bring it into the policy discussions, and bring them out of this kind of not visible space that women inhabit, and looking at their power and recognizing it.
I mean, as a Lebanese, I'm a living example of how the lack of transitional justice in my own country, and how this lack of the exercise of dealing with the past has led us from one crisis to another, or actually has kept us in the same crisis without being able to actually come out of it. And so, I mean, it really resonates what you're saying. It really resonates, and I'm very happy to know that Crisis Group is actually working in this space, because this idea, this topic is still not accessible to the mainstream population. It's a bit of an elitist concept, and I think papers like this one, where we're interviewing, women on the ground, and sort of work that you're doing on the field, will help mainstream this idea of transitional justice, that every single one of us is affected by it. This is not something that, it's done on the top and then we reap the fruits of it. No, we have to be engaged in it, and it affects our day-to-day lives. I'm gonna come back to you, Azadeh, with a question in a bit, but Aleksandra, one of the findings of the paper talks about the digitalization of peacebuilding. This is a very interesting topic today, because we spoke about how the nature of conflict is evolving, but also the space of conflict is evolving. So traditionally, we spoke about the physical space, the kinetic space, the land, air, and sea of conflict. Today, there is a digital space for conflict. There's a cyber space for conflict. And the tools that we need to solve these conflicts are different than the ones that we've traditionally used or attempted to use to resolve conflicts in the physical space. So can we talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, for sure. No, it's a really important topic, and it is part of the evolution of conflict, as you rightly said. And we had the additional factor of the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course, forced us all to stay home, and pushed many of these activities of dialogue and peace building into the online space. And so this is why this report took up this issue of digitalization as one of the key themes. To look also at how does this affect women's inclusion and women's participation in peace efforts. And I think what is important and what the report succeeds in doing is to present a nuanced picture, to show some of the opportunities that the online space presents, but to also talk very extensively and in detail about many of the challenges and the new challenges that that digitalization and working online presents. I think there are often hopes expressed that by moving into the online space, we're able to democratize peace efforts and bring in a greater range of actors and make it easier for people at the grassroots level to participate, bring in a younger generation of peace builders and being able to reach them more easily. And I think this can be true, and hopefully we can work towards making that true. But there are also obstacles. I think we have to be mindful of the fact that not everybody has access to digital technologies. And so we have to be very careful to not perpetuate existing patterns of exclusion that already exist. The fact that already a lot of the attention and a lot of the international support that is being given to peace actors privileges certain demographic groups. We engage a lot more with certain elite women, urban women. We have much more difficulty in reaching rural areas, more conservative areas, more underprivileged areas. We have to be careful not to perpetuate these same patterns when we move to the online space, because there are still many areas that don't actually have internet connectivity, that do not have the hardware and software that is necessary to actually do this work online. So I think these are things to be mindful of and to actively work towards overcoming. Being mindful also of the fact that the digital gender divide also still very much persists, and so that in many areas women are at a particular disadvantage in terms of being able to access these technologies. The other important thing that has come out, or that has been confirmed by this report, is the fact that we are facing, and that women are facing, particular protection issues in the online space. We have at UN Women, we have actually carried out some very important research also on documenting the increase, really the exponential increase of online violence during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the types of misogynistic hate speech, threats, and other hate speech and intimidation attempts that are being perpetuated against women online. And we have documented how this then very often extends from the online space into the physical world as well. And this is all in a context where, of course, women, peacemakers and peace builders are already facing a very challenging environment, a shrinking civic space, many attacks and intimidation attempts against them. And so the report really makes a strong appeal to think about more effective protection measures as really one of the key issues that we have to invest in if we want to support and encourage women's participation in peace efforts and in political life more widely.
No, absolutely. And speaking again of multi-layered diplomacy, how important it is for us, whether it's UN Women or the Aysam Faris Institute or Crisis Group or all the stakeholders involved in this peace building effort, to really build bridges with the digital enterprises, with Twitter, with Facebook, with Meta, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp. Many of these women are threatened via WhatsApp. You know, they have protection issues, and there is a big role to play for these companies, and they may not know the role that they have to play unless we tell them, guys, folks, listen to us, we have a whole new perspective to bring, and we need to work together to protect specifically peace builders in the online space. Now, Azadeh, you mentioned that women do a great job on the ground. They are often overlooked, and they have great success stories. But somewhere, somewhere in their work, they hit a wall. We can call it the glass ceiling, we can call it a wall, and that prevents that work from being transferred, if that's the correct use of the word, into a more official peace-building process, whether it's track 1.5 or track 1. What is the reason for this? I mean, this is something that I scratch my head over almost every day trying to understand, why are we so successful on a certain level, but then, when it comes to official representation, the numbers don't reflect it. What are we doing wrong?
That's a critical question. That's the question at the center of everything, Karma. I will start with looking at the role of the convening actors. And by that, I mean the UN, I mean states and governments that are advocates and backers of the women, peace, and security agenda, and are always trying to rhetorically bring women to the table and talk a really good game about women's inclusion. Because in the end, if we're sitting, if we're looking at this as researchers and scholars and activists, women from the countries who are facing these challenges, we know that the male politicians and the patriarchal systems and cultures that we are up against do not want to include us. Not really. I mean, we are their rivals. They want to be at the table. So we know that's partly for reasons of power. It's partly patriarchal, and that our domestic feminist gender equality seeking movements are targeting these men who are occupying a lot of political space. So that's our domestic struggle. So really, that's always going to be the case. So I think, I would point the finger, and I don't mean to say that, in an accusatory way, but I think the allies that we expect are not doing their job. Mm-hmm. Who convenes track 1? Who convenes track 1.5 and track 2 and track 3? Whether it's the UN, special envoys, Western governments that are very often the backers of these processes, they need to be doing a much better job demanding that women who are involved at the community level, grassroots level, doing peace building work are at the table as well. Mm-hmm. Because they are, and often this goes back to, what Aleksandra highlighted at the beginning, this idea of tradition. Who is the expert on whether Yemeni tradition or Syrian tradition permits or is hospitable to women being at the table? Should that be a European envoy for the United Nations making that call? Or should that be a Yemeni woman who says, look, this is my domestic struggle and it's being played out at the international table. So don't mix up, what I'm trying to be up against patriarchy. I've had a 30-year struggle with this, mm-hmm. and I have been active in my country's politics. So don't talk about, social norms from a quite Orientalist perspective, I would say, as a way of sometimes shielding also powerful states that don't want women at the table. Part of the struggle is having those who are convening, whether it's UN special envoys or Western governments, not take the easy way out, to not say, oh, traditional social norms are not hospitable to pushing this. Mm-hmm. If there's a country that is quite conservative socially and is obstructing this, let that country bear the political reputational cost of saying, no, we don't want to include women.
Azadeh, Aleksandra, is it on us to inform the convener? Is it on us to lobby? Is it on us or is it on them?
I think I think it's a collective endeavor that we're in here, and I think one thing that I thought was a very important point that was highlighted in the report was to say we need to do a better job of involving key allies, in the sense of the male gatekeepers who are there. They need to do a much better job of actually supporting women's participation. And this goes very much, I think, to the point that Azadeh was making as well. I think there is this tendency to put everything actually on the shoulders of women themselves.
Right.
But the women are not the problem, right? And so we are expecting them to fix a problem that is not actually driven by them themselves.
How much responsibility are we taking upon ourselves to fix this?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I think we need to be also more strategic and smarter about who else we try and conscript into this struggle, right? And make sure that actually everybody plays their role. And especially, you know, we've been talking about these multiple layers and levels at which peace is made, and the multitude of actors from sort of the local level to the national level to the international level. I think each piece of that puzzle is important here, and so we should be calling on everyone to actually engage on this issue and to lobby and take women's participation seriously. There is one other point that I wanted to add, because I thought it was really interesting that this was raised by several of the women that were interviewed for the report as well, which is that we need to break out of this very narrow and siloed thinking and lobbying for women's participation in peace processes, and to take a much more holistic approach and understand that you cannot just look at women's participation in mediation and peace efforts in isolation from wider issues of women's political participation, women's participation in political life, and gender equality within society more widely. And I think that is a very, very important point. It's obviously something that is difficult to do in practice, but it goes again to this issue of how many of these things are interconnected. How, you know, if you don't address violence against women and protection concerns within society, then of course you will not be able to increase participation for women, because it will not be safe for them. It will not be possible for them to do that. If you write out women out of the history books, out of the transitional justice processes that Azadeh spoke about so eloquently, then yes, of course, you will not have an appreciation of women's contribution to society, to peace. You will not have a process of genuine reconciliation when it comes also to the horrors that they've experienced and so forth. And so again, how can you then expect to have this inclusive peace process? So I think this is another important perspective to kind of not just think about these things in these sort of narrow, siloed kind of ways, but really think about the overall picture that we're looking at.
Azadeh, back to you. How do we bring in the conveners so that they are on our side? How do we convince the conveners?
I think convincing the conveners is partly a political challenge that we all need to undertake in our individual spheres. I mean, I undertake it at crisis group when I persuade or try to convince my colleagues that looking at the gender aspect of a conflict or inclusion, what is wrong in a peace process? Why is the Yemeni multi-party peace track or political track, why is it ailing? Why does it have no chance, or why has it had so little chance of progress? You know, persuading even colleagues who are liberal-minded that looking at inclusion and as Aleksandra says, not just narrow women's inclusion, but inclusion of other marginalized groups, inclusion of state parties to the conflict that are politically inconvenient. You know, who is absent that makes this process so narrow that it just doesn't really have a chance, you know, even though it exists in name. So I think some of it is, you know, a great deal of it is actually really political work about who is being excluded, whether it's a state actor. You know, if you can't resolve it without Iran, why are you trying? If you can't resolve it at the community level without you know, people from this community and people who are, you know, controlling access to this road and people who are, you know, being impacted by rising prices because of this network of roads that are not connected to each other. It's all a mosaic. And so if you know, it's a political kind of mapping of who is missing and what are the politics of the process, whether it's gender marginalization, whether it's just a a country that's politically inconvenient at the moment, but they're all crucial. So I think that's a big part of it, is persuading us to be honest also about the processes, and why their chances are the way that they are.
So Azadeh, on digitalization of peace building, is there anything that you would like to add?
I think your point, Karma, about the role of tech companies is critical, because as Aleksandra said, the shrinking civic space for women is happening online as well, not just in the street. And women's political participation is really jeopardized by the way that they are attacked, the way that their activism is shamed online. I think women journalists who are working in conflict zones and in areas that are riven with conflict online are extremely vulnerable. And I think that tech companies find this very difficult to navigate. Maybe they don't feel like it's their space, they don't have the expertise. I find that tech companies, in my experience, are very open to picking up issues like human trafficking, very obvious things that that are almost police matters. But the fact that their platforms are making it almost impossible for women journalists in certain of the countries of our region to be able to have a public platform for their journalism, which is holding those parties to the conflict accountable for their misdeeds, for their violence, is so crucial. Women who are trying to participate in politics in Libya, if they're humiliated online, or if personal information about them is used, or if their opponents want to portray their activism as offending Islam, very manipulative, but can pick up like wildfire online. It's very cynical. And this is a whole new frontier that women, whether they're journalists or activists or politicians, is very threatening for them. And it feels kind of scary to think that, that's all in the hands of people in Palo Alto, California, who run Meta, who run Twitter. But we have to find ways, I think, to lobby them as well. So this sphere that they control is not just a new danger zone for women.
Absolutely, thank you for that. Aleksandra Dier Azadeh Moaveni, thank you so much for this eye-opening conversation. And thank you for being guests with us today on the Diplowoman podcast.
Thank you so much, Kama. Pleasure to talk to you both.
Thank you. It was really wonderful speaking to you both.
Thank you.